Well, it's 7 o'clock, friends, and so a very warm welcome to this third session of the conference organised by the Quaker Truth and Integrity Group. As usual, we start this session with a short period of silent worship. Could we gather together, friends?
Good evening, friends, and welcome. My name is Carol Kelly, and I've been invited to be the elder for this evening's meeting to uphold everybody and to uphold the meeting. Before I hand over to Gerald, can I just remind us of a few Zoom etiquette things? The first one is, can you please make sure that you're muted unless you're invited to speak? Thank you. Also, if you need to get up and move around or go to have a comfort break, can you please turn off your video so we're not distracted? And also, this is a meeting for Worship for Learning, so please remember to maintain our stillness and silence and uphold our speaker and uphold each other. And when you're in breakout rooms, will you continue that process and make sure that each person in the breakout room is heard? Thank you, friends. And I will hand over to Gerald now to introduce the evening.
Gerald, you're muted.
Elementary mistake. I do apologise, friends. You'd have thought that I've learned by now, wouldn't you? I was saying that I said thank you to Carol for that introduction, and she's our elder, as she said, and if you feel you need her services at any time, please type directly to her in the chat section and she'll receive the message. Just before I start the introduction, there are one or two housekeeping issues, and I want to lay out the shape of the evening before us. The topic of tonight's session is lack of transparency and the abuse of power. And after my introduction, we'll be led this evening by Molly Scott Cato. Molly's talk will last roughly about 25 minutes. Those of you who came on Monday will be familiar with this process. After 25 minutes of the presentation, we'll have a short 5-minute shuffle break. And I have to say, Monday and Tuesday sessions were highly disciplined and returned very, very promptly. It would be helpful if we could do the same. And after the shuffle break, you will find ourselves placed in breakout rooms for about 20 minutes. There'll be 5 people or around 4 or 5 people in the breakout room. And the task of each group will be to briefly review the contribution that Molly's made, to offer possibly a short personal response, and to formulate an agreed question that you'd like answered. And in the second half, then, after breakout rooms, those questions you'll type to Chris, and he will then post the questions to me. So to summarise, introduction from me, presentation from Molly, 5-minute shuffle break, breakout rooms to devise a question. On return, one person types the question to Chris Robertson, and then I'll hopefully pick out some of the questions to ask Molly, and if we hit that'll be as much as we have time for. We might well have time for all of them. So those are the preliminary matters, friends. Moving to the introduction proper, I have to confess to being a bit reluctant to reiterate things that some of you might have heard twice before. Equally, I'm very conscious that we'll be welcoming some friends for the first time. To these particularly, I say that the arguments being made in the previous 2 introductions is that liberal democracy, as we've experienced in Britain for at least the last 3 or 4 generations, is under threat. A key element in this situation is untruth. The Financial Times journalist Gideon Rachman's latest book is called The Age of the Strong Man. He shows that across the world, authoritarian leaders share several characteristics one of which, as Misha Glenny noted in his review, is their willingness to lie brazenly, confidently, and without any sense of shame. And in his book, the UK is not exempt. The consequent breakdown in trust has profound impact and implications for our social fabric. It's not just politicians, of course. Rowan Williams writes of the dramatic evacuation of proportion, generosity, and candour from a great deal of public life. The journalist George Monbiot speaks of an epistemic crisis, the collapse of a shared acceptance of the means by which truth is discovered. Our friend John Lampen characterises it thus: we live in an era of post-truth, fake news, and promises which won't be kept. Advertising, either vacuous or misleading, stimulates the greed which is destroying our home planet. Financial misreporting is common. Social media provide platforms for rampant bigotry with vicious and hurtful personal attacks. His conclusion, friends, is a challenge for all here. Now, if ever, is a time for us to witness to our ancient testimony. It's no accident, therefore, that this conference is called Living Truth, a rallying call for Quakers. For the third time this week, I have no hesitation in saying that the challenge for us today is as that for Quakers in 1652. Firstly, to be patterns and examples. That is, to live out truth and integrity. Simultaneously, to challenge our surrounding milieu, demanding better. So how is it that we can witness to our ancient testimony? How do we build truth and integrity in our country in order to increase levels of trust in each other and in government? How can we support politicians to maintain and build integrity? What can we do to make apparent the warm relations and close working across parties, which often takes place in the House of Commons behind the theatre of Prime Minister's questions? What can we do to build and inhabit ourselves the kind of ground that the Swarthmore lecture speaks of? There will be points where we will need to work with others. But in these challenging times, what are we as Quakers uniquely called to do? Those of us in the Truth and Integrity group will, if you've heard this before, if you've been in previous sessions, you'll have heard me say this. We hope this conference is the start of our collective response to such questions, both a seedbed of ideas and a springboard for future action. Our best hope is for a release of energy so that a number of friends feel called to diverse initiatives all under the common concern. You'll have heard me say, if you've attended previous sessions, that the conference has been designed as a whole. The 3 evening sessions taken together help us to look at the situation in the round. If you have missed previous sessions, you may be happy to know that they, like this one, have been recorded. And like this one, they will be accessible via our website sometime in the near future.
Is it? Was there something?
I'd like to tell you when they'll be available on the website, friends, but as Martina Weich, who's done so much to pull this conference together, as Martina said in conversation the other night, this conference has not so much been organised on a shoestring as half a shoestring. So when we know when it's on the website, you will learn, you'll receive an email. If this is your first time attending these evening sessions, you will not have therefore heard me invite you to the Saturday morning session, where we'll try and draw themes together and agree a framework for action. Part of that work will be to draw up a clear statement of principles encapsulating our concern in the clearest terms. And with this statement, we'll feel empowered to approach other groups and churches and faiths, hoping we might work together, find common ways of working. We are excited by this prospect, even as we are daunted. But now, having outlined the purposes of the conference as a whole, the general shape of this evening, we're very pleased to welcome Molly Scott Cato. Molly was an MEP, and when she spoke to some of us last year in conversation, before QTIG had even begun to exist as a formal body, she spoke passionately about the power of working together and the sheer hard work and hard-headed clarity needed to negotiate a path to common goals with people who might be political opponents. I personally learned a lot from in that conversation, and also a lot about her character in that telling moment captured on YouTube, where a Brexit MP challenged her credentials to make pronouncements on trade deals. The blindingly obvious subtext of that question was that someone who is a member of the Green Party cannot have the faintest idea about big boy stuff like trade deals, especially if she's a woman. Politely, clearly, firmly, the man is told, "You obviously haven't been paying attention to my CV. I was, and I remain, a professor of economics." Do Google it, friends, it's on YouTube. Drawing upon this wealth of experience and expertise, I ask Molly when she's ready to offer us her thoughts.
Thank you so much, Gerald. Thank you for setting such a good pattern yourself. I really admire the way you speak slowly and deliberately. I'm afraid I'm not very good at doing that myself. So if I start rushing along, please somebody wave at me and tell me to slow down. It was a very interesting conversation we had, whenever it was, probably as much as a year ago now. And I feel I'm bringing myself as a resource and I'm sharing my experience, but I definitely don't feel that I have answers to all the questions. I feel daunted myself at the thought that these questions are going to emerge from the breakout groups. And because I think, you know, a lot of when I'm teaching, the main thing I think is getting the right questions, and finding the answers takes a long time, and we won't resolve that tonight, but hopefully we'll make some progress anyway. And I just wanted to say I've followed very closely what Gerald's told me to follow through on, and he's given me a list of sort of questions and areas, and I'm going to go through those. But just by way of introduction, I wanted to explain how I got into this turf of addressing the very serious issues that Gerald has brought to our attention. Hang on, I'm just distracted by myself, so I'm just going to turn myself off so I can't see myself. Show self view. No, I've gone. Good. So I was an MEP and I resisted Brexit, and I campaigned for us to stay in the European Union. And during that process, it became clear to me that what I'd always understood as our political culture was breaking down in various ways. The lies, the deliberate telling of lies, was something that people say politicians are liars, but that's in my experience not true. It's occasionally true. I'm pathologically honest. It's not very helpful in various areas of life, including in politics. There are times when it's actually helpful in social intercourse, in my view, to not be strictly adhering to the truth, but I can't do that. So I've trained my children that way as well, and sometimes they complain to me, you know, does my bum look big in this kind of questions? You know, sometimes it's just better to gloss over those, but I can't do that. So I've always been very committed to the truth, and that's probably what's drawn me to becoming a Quaker. And I have Quakers in my family, so maybe they taught me that way. But in politics, my experience is people negotiate and they change their position, and that's how politics works. That's not a bad thing. But Brexit was something completely different. People were deliberately distorting truth, and they were, instead of winning arguments, they were telling lies, and that was quite frightening. And for me and my staff team, most of whom are quite young, they were very disturbed about what was going on. So we said, we'll put some effort into working out what's happening here. And we essentially studied what other people have said about fascism, and we were looking at, so Umberto Eco has 14, I think it is, signs of fascism, and Timothy Snyder's also done some really useful work here, and we drew out the signs of fascism, and we found that all of them were being met in the UK society in 2016 or 17, whenever we did this work, and that was extremely disturbing. And that's still on my website, called, you know, if you search Molly Scott Cato Fight Fascism, that will all pop up. And I think obviously the distortion of truth is a key aspect of that, both the use of propaganda, the use of the big lie as a propaganda technique, but also the portrayal of oneself as the victim, as well as the sort of all-powerful. That's a very powerful psychological trope that you see Putin using right now. Anyway, there's much more about that there. And I think that's, for me, that was an important starting point, because I very much agree with what Gerald said, that, I mean, I have never really thought about myself as a liberal, but I do think, because I think of myself as a radical, but I do think liberal democracy is the right phrase to use. And that is what we're actually losing. We're losing the struggle for that right now. So I'm very pleased that you've organized this and you're coming together. And I feel that a group of powerful friends such as ourselves actually can make a really important intervention here. And we should feel confident about that, as I'll move on to that in a minute. Yeah, and I would say that my personal contribution here is as somebody who's worked as a politician and has that experience, and I'm happy to share that, and I'm glad to be with you this evening from that point of view. And I think it's the right question, you know, what are it, given that we're here because we think this form of democratic politics is under threat, in my view, under attack, what are we called upon to do, I think is the right question. So I'm going to start there. And this is something I think I mentioned to Gerald when we spoke before. And this is the idea of an epistle that can be used. I think it, you know, it's Gerald's word, epistle, but I think it's a good word. I said it should be something like the Arbroath Declaration, and we talked about that a bit. And I didn't honestly know that much about the Arbroath Declaration, but it's like it's a formal commitment that you write down. You write a form of words, and the form of the words is very important. And then you sign that yourself, and you encourage other people to sign it. So I see that as a sort of public demonstration of commitment to better standards in public life. And the Declaration of Arbroath itself was a statement of Scotland's right to independence that was made in 1320, and it was signed by kind of noblemen. So it's in that sense not relevant. But what's relevant about it is this sense of political theatre and a very carefully worded text, short but to the point. I would also incidentally bring in at this point the US Declaration of Independence, which is another extraordinarily and powerful document that people sign and stand by in this type of area of politics. And of course, US democracy is really struggling at the moment, but it was, when it was founded as a republic, you know, as a democratic republic where, well, men could vote and, you know, free men could vote, that's still a completely radical experiment, really, that the US tried, and very impressive, I think. And I think if you consider the Declaration of Independence, you know, phrases like "we hold these truths to be self-evident" and that people have certain inalienable rights, I just bring those forth because I think we all remember them. They kind of resonate, and when they resonate, they have enormous power in the words themselves. And this is something I find also in, you know, Quaker faith and practice, and a lot of the, like Gerald just said, you know, that we have to be patterns and examples wherever we go and so on. And for me, the phrase "rejoice in the splendor of God's continuing creation" is one I find really valuable in my work as a Green politician. But I just want to say, I know we don't, as Friends, underestimate the power of words, and words carefully chosen and then committed to, I think, can really start to shift things. And so that's why when we were talking, I suggested to Gerald that is a contribution Quakers can make, both because I think Quakers are incredibly good with words. You know, the people who have written these words have really chosen exactly the right words, and words that have weight and meaning can be very powerful. But also because I think, well, there are plenty of times historically, and again, as Gerald said, you've been delving into the deep history, but you know, where Quakers have made really important political interventions. This is another time, I think. Just to say as well that what followed, so in Scotland, not really what followed the Arbroath Declaration, but in Scotland, a constitutional convention was established in 1989, and that is effectively what led to the Scottish Parliament, and in my view will eventually lead to Scottish independence. So I think very often things like documents and conventions and assemblies, they feel like, oh no, it's just another committee. But I think nothing could be further from the truth. I think the political theatre aspect of this and the power of the words aspect of this are both really important. So Gerald's second point that he asked me to address is that once you have established this declaration, then the next important thing is to bring other people on board and to work with other people. And I just wanted to say that I was really impressed by the way the Archbishop of Canterbury condemned government policy on refugees. I hear they've said today that they're absolutely standing by that and they're not being intimidated by the Prime Minister, which is entirely the correct thing to do. I had some problems back in 2019 when I stood for election for the European Parliament for the second time. And there were some really odious and, in my view, fascist candidates standing. I mean, UKIP was bad enough. I can't even remember the name of this outfit now that these guys were representing. But I just said, I'm sorry, I'm tolerant and I believe everybody has a right to stand in a democracy, but these people have gone beyond my pale and I won't debate with them. And I had several run-ins, because a lot of the debates that take place actually in church buildings, in Church of England buildings. And so I refused to debate with these guys, and I wrote to the Church of England people who were organising it, and I said, this is why I won't debate with them. I think you should exclude these people from the platform. Anyway, I had different reactions. My own bishop here in Gloucester, Rachel Treweek, understood what I was saying, but she said, well, you know, I can't not have somebody else. So I stood outside as a sort of vigil, and other people stood with me. So I was able to make my point in that way. But in Exeter, actually, I can't remember what the name of the guy is. I'm not very good on the hierarchy of the Church of England, but he came out and tried very hard to persuade me to come in, wouldn't respect the stand I was taking effectively, which was entirely acting under conscience, as I made very clear to him. Anyway, after that, I wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury and I said, when democracy is under threat, it's absolutely the job of religious authorities to stand up to to stand up for democracy and the rule of law. And I'm not saying he did that because I wrote him by any means, but after he then said that the refugee policy was the opposite of the nature of God, which I think is a really good way of putting what's wrong with it. I sent him a card saying, really pleased. And I think it's really important that we cooperate. A lot of people are concerned in the way we're concerned. We're not particularly working together at the moment, but you can see people taking stands. And so I absolutely thought, yeah, I'm going to send him a card and say, I so much support what you're doing and taking that stand. And so I think there is scope for working with other faith groups, but also with a lot of other organizations who are as concerned as we are about what's happening. Yeah, and the other thing, one of the things I learned from Timothy Snyder is the importance of institutions. And this is something, institutions seem like really dull things. They don't seem like something that you'd, want to rush to the defense of. But actually it is the institutions that hold our liberal democracy in place. So, we can think of things like trade unions are a good example, but there's also just things like choirs and, social clubs of various sorts. All those institutions are what brings society together. People learn how to take minutes or all the skills that you need to be part of a democratic society. And institutions are being emptied. They're firstly, people aren't joining them. And secondly, people aren't running them. And then people aren't respecting them. All sorts of institutions are in decline. And that's something we can all do. Join an institution and make sure it's stronger than it was, a year ago, and keep building them and support institutions. And when people attack institutions, the BBC is a good example, which is constantly under attack. I think it's really important that, yes, you can be critical, but you have to support the institution itself. And religious institutions, of course, have a particular authority. Actually, I heard on the news this evening that it's only in the UK and Tehran that religious leaders have a place in the legislature, it shows how completely bonkers our parliament is. But yeah, anyway, they do have legitimacy and they do have authority. And so I think we should be building a movement by cooperating with those kinds of institutions. And I think it would bring people in. A lot of people are deeply concerned about what's happening and they are aware of it, but they don't really understand what they can do. So I shouldn't really have started with what you can do, but this is the way the order that things came in. So I'm going to spend a bit of time now giving some examples of what's going wrong. So firstly, I'm sure you've talked about this before, but we've got very serious threats to democracy across the world, but I'm just going to focus on what's happening in Europe. So one good example is the vote, 42% for Marine Le Pen last Sunday in the French presidential election. Marine Le Pen is not a democratic politician. She's a fascist in my view. She's an anti-democratic figure, and she comes from her father was the same. They don't believe in democratic system. Had she been elected, she would have begun to dismantle the structures that require France to be a democracy. So it was a relief that she didn't win, but it's very disturbing that 40% of people in France were prepared to vote for somebody like that, either because they didn't care, or actually it's that she one of the key tools of somebody like her is to mobilize grievance and to get people to vote against something rather than for something. So I'm voting for change. I heard a black woman interviewed on Channel 4 News. I'm voting for change. Actually, it might be a change where people like her are prohibited from holding certain types of jobs. That's the kind of thing you would expect Marine Le Pen to introduce. But it's a sort of, I'm sick of what's happening now. I'm voting for change. I'll vote for Le Pen. That's very disturbing. And we've seen similar things in Hungary and Poland, where politicians of the far right have come into power and have then dismantled the institutions of the state, particularly independent media outfits. And also in both those countries, the president has funneled a lot of money towards his own family or towards his own personal schemes. So we see both corruption and the shutting down of genuine democratic debate. And I'm going to speak in a little bit about some of the things that we see in the UK that are signs of very similar signs to what's happening in those other countries, just at an earlier stage. And of course, one of the things I saw as an MEP was the way that the British Conservative Party worked very closely was in a group actually with the party Fidesz. Actually, the Hungarian party sits in the main right-wing group, which is extraordinary that they haven't been expelled from there. But so some of the group called ECR, where the British Tories chose to sit, was, you know, was very close to these kind of extreme positions, and I think that's really infected backwards into the British Conservative Party, which is no longer, in my view, a functional democratic party. And then, of course, you have what Gerald was talking about earlier, where you have lies told, promises that can't be kept. And the result of that is people are disillusioned with governments, and they end up saying, well, it doesn't matter who I vote for because both types of politics are letting me down. Obviously, this is a real problem when you have only two parties, when you have a two-party system. Both of them have promised me things and not fulfilled. So the system itself is broken, and that's when people really start to question democracy. And the rise in questioning of whether democracy is actually the best system over recent years, especially amongst young people, I think is one of the most telling signs and disturbing signs that something's going seriously wrong. And of course, we're talking here about truth and lies, and to me, it's really important to find out where people get their information from. What do people know about the world, and how do they know it? This is what George Monbiot said in terms of his epistemic crisis. You know, people are choosing to believe lies, and people are being told a lot of untruths through the standard media that they have access to. So we can think about the Evening Standard, which is owned by Evgeny Lebedev, whose father was a KGB agent, who was then put into the House of Lords, who took over that paper when Boris Johnson was London mayor, and then supported Boris Johnson, supported you know, his rise to power effectively. So there's this really unhealthy relationship between people who control knowledge through ownership of newspapers and the politicians themselves. I mean, obviously there's laws we could change so that you have to be a British citizen to own a, you know, and you can only own a very limited number, like one newspaper or this all Green Party, but we're not in government. And while we're not in government, these people of the media tycoons, the Barclay brothers, one of them's died now, but you know, they have owned the Telegraph and the Spectator, that group, for years. They don't make money out of it. It's a pure propaganda vehicle. It's now the place where a lot of government policies are first announced through an article written in the Telegraph. They're not even announced to Parliament now. That is an incredibly biased form of media. You know, a lot of the Brexit lies were propagated through the Telegraph. Of course, it's where Boris Johnson was originally a columnist, and how he made his career through writing those sort of Brussels, deceitful Brussels stories into the Telegraph. And also they paid him an enormous salary, which enabled him to build his political career. Now we've got Elon Musk buying Twitter. So the richest man in the world is going to own a very powerful social media platform. There's nothing apparently we could do to stop that. And Trump has been banned from that platform, not because he was offensive, but well, although of course he was offensive, but because he used the platform to mobilize against democracy, to overturn a democratic verdict of the American people. That's why he was banned from the platform. And yet Elon Musk says he's, you know, an extreme believer in free speech. So even if that free speech is used to try and overturn democracy, it will still be allowed on Twitter. I don't know if you use Twitter. It's kind of typical for people like me. It's a platform that's used by politicians and journalists particularly. It's very powerful in terms of the impact that it can have. And it's very disturbing that Elon Musk, who's, you know, somebody that's as rich and powerful as that, should not be controlling the outlets that we get our information from. It's encouraging that Margareta Vestager, who's one of my real political heroines, who is the digital commissioner for the European Parliament, they've agreed a law very recently within her remit. And I heard Alexandra Gezer, who's a German Green MEP, this morning saying that if Musk contravenes the law that the European Union has now passed, then they will be paying large fines. And actually digital platforms that operate within the EU now have to pay a registration fee, which will fund the regulation of that sector. So that feels like an important step forward that was reached last week. Unfortunately, at the same time, Elon Musk took over Twitter. I don't really need to tell you, I'm sure, about what's happening with Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, but effectively, that was the way that a lot of the strong men that Gerald was talking about came to power, both through Facebook itself and through targeting and advertising to people very specifically with particular messages tagged for them, and also through the use of WhatsApp. WhatsApp was used in Brazil to elect Bolsonaro. Anyway, so this area of information, how it's controlled by the rich and powerful to enable them to maintain their unfair share of wealth and power, is absolutely crucial to the issues we're talking about. And just lastly, I mean, again, I'm sure you've covered these already, but it's just some of the examples of why our own government is a threat to democracy. I think if you've studied constitutions and you've worked as a politician, some of these things are kind of apparent to you, but they feel a little bit abstract. Like when you say, oh, attacking the rule of law, what do we actually mean by that? I feel that incredibly strongly, and I see all sorts of ways that the rule of law is under threat, but it can feel a little bit abstract. I'm going to give some examples here, but I would say one of the most important things is that when a judgment is given in a law court that the government has broken the law, they should be horrified by that, and they should immediately take steps to address it. That hasn't happened with some recent judgments. We've had the judgment today that what Matt Hancock did in not protecting people in care homes was actually unlawful. But rather than his response being, that's really, I'm sorry, that's appalling, his response is, actually, a lot of the judgment went in my favor. That's something, again, completely new. And that's a very clear indication that this government and these Conservatives are not respecting the independence of the judiciary. Of course, you've also got the deliberate attacks on the judiciary, such as the attacks on human rights lawyers when they introduced the refugee policy, the enemies of the people sort of attack when the judges were, making various judgments to uphold the constitution during the Brexit process. So these are all signals of what's going on. But we've also had the government itself acting in a way that's outside our constitution. So one of the big problems we've got is that we don't have a written constitution, which I'll come back to in a bit. But given that we have this sort of constitutional conventions, a lot of them have been broken by this government. So we all famously remember the prorogation of Parliament when Rees-Mogg and Johnson, they closed Parliament because Parliament was just about to stop Brexit from happening, actually, and to move towards a people's vote. So they'd lost the argument. So what did they do? They shut down the democratic institution. That is a classic move of an authoritarian. They told the Queen that she should prorogue Parliament, which actually makes me even more furious that when she's upheld the constitution so well and so dutifully for so long that they would traduce her. Anyway, then we have Brenda Hale at the Supreme Court overruling that, and they did not, and then they have to respect. So you see how there's a tussle now between the Constitution and the rule of law. That again is something completely new and very disturbing. Last week we saw Peter Hennessy say that the way Boris Johnson was behaving was shredding the ministerial code, because the Prime Minister is responsible for the ministerial code. If he then breaks the law, if he lies to Parliament, he has to hold himself to account. It's an absurdity. There are no checks and balances within our system. So this is a weakness of our constitution. It assumes people are gentlemanly and honest and respectful. And if you have somebody like Boris Johnson coming into that system, it can just, ride roughshod over everything. Two examples of many where the government has actually itself broken the law, two very significant ones. Firstly, the flouting of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So you probably remember it was Northern Ireland that was preventing Brexit from happening, and Boris Johnson's political career depended on Brexit happening. So he made the deal with Leo Varadkar, and then there was a video of him speaking to Northern Ireland business leaders saying, oh, we'll just throw that in the bin afterwards. We won't take that international legally binding agreement that we've reached with with 27 other governments. We won't actually take that seriously. And actually, they haven't taken it seriously, because they haven't introduced the measures that are required under the Brexit Treaty, and they haven't either in terms of imports. So we are, as a country, significantly in breach of international law. And the only reason the European Commission hasn't started legal proceedings is because they think it would be politically more difficult if they did that. But you know, they have a case there. Similarly, this latest Rwanda policy is flouting the Refugee Convention that was, you know, that we signed up to in 1949. So again, it's the UK government breaching international legal conventions. So these are just a few examples, but it's more really it's more a sort of atmosphere I think this government has created that, oh, you know, like I think it was Brandon Lewis said, you know, yeah, okay, we'll break international law. Who cares kind of thing. It's that attitude that tells you this is a whole different ball game now, because any other government, any other prime minister would have been shocked and appalled to have been found in breach of law. And this is why former prime ministers from both the, you know, both Labour and Conservatives have roundly condemned the way this government's behaving, because it's an attack on the system itself, the democratic system itself. So I've gone on for a long time now. I'm just going to talk a bit about how we can do politics better. But, you know, by all means, let's come back to this when we come back from the breakout rooms, because I think, as Gerald said, I think it's really important to understand that politicians, I'm going to say, do trust each other, do work together, do cooperate, because that's mostly true. But it isn't true of the kind of people who've taken control of the Conservative Party at the moment. They are ideologues and they are not cooperators, and they are looking to control power rather than to find the best outcome. But generally, it's true to say that, you know, behind the scenes, politicians tend to cooperate with each other. Now, where I worked in the European Parliament, you had to do that because nobody ever had a majority. The British majoritarian system, where it's like Tweedledum and Tweedledee, that's how I think of it. You know, it's one or the other. So one party gets absolute power, then the other party sits there attacking that party until they get absolute power for a bit, and back and forth and back and forth. It's not good for decision making. It's not good for the image of politics, because the duty of the opposition is just to oppose, and so, you know, it just looks conflictual. Whereas in a multi-party system, in order to get anything agreed, you have to work to build a majority across the party divides. So I'm a huge fan of the German constitution, which after all was written by British and US lawyers after the war to turn a country that had been fascist for 12 years, which is a long time, how to ensure that a democratic system successfully embedded there. So they made sure it was a very strong constitution. I would love to just import it to this country. I think it would transform everything. But anyway, that's not going to happen. But in the European Parliament and in the German Parliament, you have to build a coalition in order to make a step forward. And the point is then, rather than waiting for the other government to get in and unpick what you've done, you've all agreed that this is what has to be done. You've all made that step forward together. And so you are making genuine progress. I think also, something that I noticed disappeared with the Brexit vote is something that's absolutely crucial to democracy working, and that's losers' consent. You know, if you feel people have made their arguments fairly, they've told the truth, they've won the argument, you know, that there was a control over how much money could be spent, there was fair press and so on, fair media, then, you know, you lose and you think, well, that's a great shame, I'm really sorry I lost, but I accept that it was a fair fight and I lost. People aren't feeling like that about democracy anymore, and that was very evident in Brexit. I mean, Brexit was won through a massive amount of totally illicit and a lot of it illegal activity, data theft and targeted advertising and overspending and lots of things like that. So that made me not prepared to accept the result, because I didn't think it was a fair result, and that really shocked me, because I believe in democracy and I know that losers' consent is a crucial part of democracy. So if I'm in a state of saying, actually, as a loser, you don't have my consent because it wasn't a fair process, then that is worrying. And that's happening more and more in elections. And you saw a sort of massive, writ large example of that with Donald Trump deliberately challenging this principle of losers' consent by basically lying about the outcome of the election. And so when Pence came and said, I accept, you know, that Biden is the president, it was at that point that US democracy was saved. Otherwise, it could have been the end of US democracy. We were right on the edge there. So how could we do things differently? More cooperation. reinforcing this respect for other candidates and other parties. Like I always say when I'm on a platform with other candidates, we had a very nasty election here in 2019. The Tory woman and I got horribly barracked and intimidated really by a lot of Labour activists who were shipped in from elsewhere. And there was a lot of attacks on her on public platforms. And I always said to the people in the audience, look, when you attack her, you're attacking the people who vote for her and you're attacking democracy. So we have to respect each other. We have to, respecting your opponents was a central part of democracy. It surprised me when I was first involved in active politics. And it was always the case until Brexit. And now it's just like fair game, you know, to attack, to be disrespectful to your opponents. I remember the first time it happened to me, it was Conor Byrne in Bournemouth towards the end of the Brexit debate. I was so shocked because it was an absolutely central norm of our political system. And that's something we need to rebuild. That needs to be in the epistle. 3 other things I'll just say quickly. Ending safe seats is really important because at the moment, the parties control the seats unless you live in a marginal. The whole concept of a marginal is a British concept. You know, it only makes sense if you have a first past the post system. First past the post turns democracy into a horse race. That's why it's called first past the post. It's a bad way of choosing representatives. But in this system, you have to win a majority. If your seat has a majority for a certain party, then it's a safe seat. It's like a rotten borough. You can put anybody in there, and that means you don't get good candidates and they don't feel any requirement to be good representatives because they know they're just there forever. It applies to Conservative and Labour seats. So it's not a party political thing, except that other parties don't have safe seats. So MPs need to be made accountable. There needs to be a sense of competition, and that requires, in my view, a different electoral system. Also because when I voted, I'm 58 now, I voted for 40 years. I've never elected an MP. I'm really fed up with that. I think my votes need to turn into seats, and I think everybody's votes should be treated freely and fairly. There's 2 reasons why votes aren't treated freely and fairly. One is because it takes 800,000 votes to elect a Green MP and 30,000 votes to elect a Scottish Nationalist MP. So they're not fair, right? The votes are not fair. And they're not really free either, because people are constantly told that they have to vote tactically. So you come under, if you live in a marginal like I do, you come under massive pressure. Firstly, not to stand, and secondly, not to vote for, a party other than the 2 that we're told has to win. So we don't have free and fair elections in this country, and we really should. And lastly, as I alluded to before, I think a written constitution is absolutely vital. I mean, in Germany, you have your own rights enshrined in the first bit of the constitution. And this, of course, is a response to fascism. So what are your rights? What can the government not do to you? And, what are your human rights and your political and civic rights? And then moving on to how the different bodies that make up the government of that country, what their roles and responsibilities are, what their powers are, how their powers interact, and so on. In this country, we just don't have that. And that's why the government can get away with illegally proroguing Parliament. Okay, the courts can come in and stop that, but a lot of the damage is already done, actually. And there's plenty of other ways in which they're constantly fixing and fiddling things in Parliament that we don't even understand or know about, because there's no rules that can stop them. So if they have the power, if they have a 40-seat majority, it can basically get away with a lot of things that they shouldn't be able to. And a constitution would stop them doing that. Right, that's all the content that I wanted to say. I just wanted to come back now to what I was saying at the beginning about the form of words, because I think the crucial question is, as Gerald put it, what are Quakers called upon to do? And I think I felt very strongly that I was called upon to understand how this far right, I call it fascist, you might not feel comfortable with that, populist is a misnomer in my view. But anyway, how this movement towards authoritarianism in politics, how it's working and what can I do about it? So my main thing was understanding how it's working. I did do that, but I think the next step is to state what it is we want to see instead. And I've suggested some ideas, but I'm absolutely not the wordsmith here. I'm sure there are very, very good wordsmiths, but I've already made a strong case that Quakers are good with words, and when words are used well, they're extremely powerful. So that's why I think that the declaration, or the epistle, as Gerald calls it, is really important. And I think beyond that, we need to build a campaign. I call it the campaign for real democracy, like the campaign for real ale. I feel like I've lived long enough now without having a proper democracy. It's most countries have collapsed into, they've lost a war, or they've collapsed into some kind of civil strife or something, and out of that they built a proper democracy. That never happened here. We're still living with a sort of 18th century gentleman's agreement, smoke-filled rooms kind of mess, really. And it's time so one of the things we need to campaign for is a constitutional convention that writes us a proper constitution, but also, to restore the norms. You've got the rules in a constitution, but the norms are crucially important as well. And I think I've identified some of them, but I think identifying what the norms are would be crucial as well to going into that epistle. So that's all from me. And like I said, I'm very interested in hearing your questions, but I absolutely can't promise to answer them. I might end up saying, that's a really good question, but I'll do my best where I can to at least elucidate them a bit. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for everything you're doing. It's really important. Look forward to seeing you again in a bit. You're on mute again, Gerald.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you very much. We'll take a break there, friends. It's 19:56 by my computer. So if we come in at 1 minute past 8, that will be great. Thank you. Well, friends, thank you for promptly returning. I think now Chris will put us into breakout rooms. And the idea is that you briefly rehearse Molly's argument, offer a brief personal response, and then agree a question that you'd like Molly to respond to when you come back from breakout rooms. I'm going to say that we'll have 15 minutes in breakout rooms, friends. So it'll be a question of working calmly, quietly, but very efficiently. Thanks, Chris.
Yes, I do believe they've all left.
Well, welcome back, friends. And I hope you had a brief but stimulating session together. Could one person from your group type in your question? And while that's happening, there's an interesting question already in the chat section that I see. And remember to type your question to Chris, and he'll make sure they get to me. Molly, what role do you think social media had in the presentation of the Brexit argument? That sort of links last night and tonight, actually. So that's a very useful question, I think.
So I had somebody write a report for me about this, which is called Facing Down Facebook, which explains the way Facebook was manipulated. But I'm not remembering the detail now, but effectively what happened was Cambridge Analytica took a lot of data from Facebook so that people could be individually targeted and messages were sent to them. They did this right at the end of the campaign. I think they spent £2 million in the last 3 or 4 days of the campaign. So they were losing the campaign, and everybody thought that Remain would win. And at that point, they send these very targeted messages to people. So it's like, your child suffers from asthma or something, and they say the European Union is banning asthma drugs. That's how it worked. But each person had their own little message going to them, and they were based around fear. So somebody came up to me in one of those debates and said, you want to let jihadis in so they can rape my daughter. It was really specific stuff like that, and very manipulative. And they did that by profiling people on Facebook. That's the job that Cambridge Analytica did, which probably wasn't illegal, but it should have been. They overspent to achieve this. They ran it through Cambridge Analytica Canada. Chris Wiley, that's his name, isn't it, has explained all of this, and Shara Sani. So it wasn't just like, it was used in a manipulative, illegal, and hugely distorted way. So, for example, to environmentalists, they sent, some of the adverts are public now, and they sent one saying, the EU, is the reason polar bears are starving. And another one said they want to take your cuppa, So basically just massively deceitful, lying ads, very specifically targeted at particular groups of people, plus the micro-targeted messaging. So yeah, that's how they did it.
Thank you. There are a couple. I'm going to link a couple of questions here, Molly. That sounds quite simple, but I'm sure it's going to be a complex response. How can we, as Quakers, help promote a constitutional convention in the face of government that we know will resist the idea very firmly? And how can we start with a declaration? Who has the convening power to bring together a constitutional convention commission?
Well, I see this epistle that we've been talking about as the first step. And I think that would be for Friends to state very clearly and in strong, resonant language exactly what we want to see. And then the idea will be to build outwards from there to include other religious groups and other institutions, and then to make one of the key demands there this constitutional convention. So that will be intrinsic to what's being written in the epistle, I would suggest. Because it's about the rules and the norms. So the truth telling is a norm, right? But unless you've got the rules and the norms working, then your system won't work. And I think it would really be worthwhile investing some time in seeing. There's two places this has been done effectively. One is in Scotland and one is in South Africa, and both of them involves the churches as key institutions in building that coalition.
Thank you. Can QCEA and QNO do valuable behind-the-scenes work to help cooperation and candour between people and different parties in a safe, private space? Can British Quakers do more of this kind of work to support the many goodwill politicians in our own system? And if British Quakers can do more, how would they go about it, Molly?
Well, that's a bit beyond my scope because I'm not a member of Parliament. I don't really understand how Parliament works, but I think those relationships are already pretty good. I would say that an alternative role, which is not happening at all, is international diplomacy now. I think it's really worrying that we have such bad relationships with other European countries, especially France. I mean, that relationship is completely falling apart. Nobody is now, because our diplomats work for the government. So if the government tells them to, be obstructive over the refugee policy, say, or over the fisheries policy, they have to do that. So who's there building good relationships when the government's doing kind of anti-diplomacy for postural, theatrical reasons? So I would say I see a really important role there that's not being fulfilled. In terms of working together between MPs, I think my thing around losers' consent and respect for opponents is the most important thing there. But to be honest, apart from the sort of Brexity Tories, I think that mostly still holds.
Thank you. How do we address the role that power players, such as the billionaire press, media owners and multinationals and assorted oligarchs, in shaping the political and media landscape? How do we address that?
Well, that's a lot of the work I did as an MEP. The European Union is addressing that. I mean, the Digital Services Act will address some of that. In fact, it's quite a powerful. I haven't looked into it in detail. I'd like to, but it's only just been agreed. But it will. So GDPR was the first step here. It gave you control of your personal data. And stopped the data theft that I've been talking about. But the next step is to really control the information platforms. And that's what Vestager has been doing. And the proposal there was negotiated with the council and the parliament last week. So that will put limits on what the media tycoons can do anyway. But at the level of who owns your media, that's at national level. So we need to change the national law. I've written a report about that as well. Again, I can't remember what it's called. And the other part of the question was, what was the other part of the question? Try the question again. I've missed a part of it.
Yeah, that's okay. Addressing the role of power players.
Oh yeah, the corporations. Yeah. Well, this is the lobbying. This is the lobbying point. And again, the Green Group in the European Parliament proposed some just restrictions on lobbying. How many times people can meet? If you look at all those lobbyists that went off to the Glasgow Climate Conference, the biggest group there, bigger than any country's delegation, was the the fossil fuel lobbyists. So just don't do it. I mean, you know, and people should have to report everything they get from lobbyists and should have to report all their meetings. This is just not required. And you just, for example, the EU taxonomy that defines what sustainable finance is, it's got gas and nuclear in there. And you can see all those meetings where the gas industry went along and put pressure on people, and who knows what they offered them. You know, there should be a limit on how many times you can meet these people, and all your meetings should have to be reported.
This indicates the difficulty of the work, I think, and is a very helpful question. It's not a group question, it's an impersonal one. No, the group couldn't agree question. How do we protect and support this seed of change, as those on the extreme right will want to stop us protecting liberal democracy and will use any way to do this?
Well, I think we have fundamentally a strong democratic culture. I think Partygate really shows you that. People are appalled and horrified. And one of the things that makes people appalled and horrified is the thought that the government is above the law. And that's a key indicator of an authoritarian government, right? That the government can break the law with impunity. And the government hasn't been able to break the law with impunity. It was shocking that the police didn't investigate, and there was a lot of pressure. You know, I mean, Jenny Jones, who's my friend and colleague, Green Peer, she wrote to the, she's been sat on the Met supervisory body, and she wrote to the Met and said, why aren't you investigating? And, you know, various people had to put pressure on the Met. Why weren't they investigating? They have a policeman on the door there. So they knew who was going in and out. They knew what was happening. And that was worrying, because that's a weakening of the rule of law, right? The police didn't dare investigate number 10. But under considerable pressure, they did do that. And the citizenry generally in this country are shocked, appalled and horrified, partly because of just the partying when other people were dying, but partly because they recognise that allowing powerful people to ignore the law is a very threatening and dangerous thing. And that goes right back to Magna Carta. So I feel that's pretty strong in Britain, and that's something we really have to work with. We have to sort of connect that sense people have that we're all equal under the law. And that we have a right to, our democratic standards are much weaker for the reason I've given. You know, we've never had a real democracy. People accept extremely undemocratic processes, which I think, you know, they should have rejected long since. So there we have to do some work. But on the rule of law side, I think the culture's strong. And so we just have to keep reminding people of that and reminding people why that matters. That's, and I was saying in the breakout group I was in, that I think this is something where Quakers in Britain Twitter feed could, you know, and social media and communications could identify. I have a thing where I do a democracy alert every time I feel something breaches these sort of rules of my understanding of what's important with the rule of law. And I think, you know, that's something where the Friends Twitter handle could do that as well, explaining to people why are we upset about this? Here's clearly how it threatens to undermine democratic standards and the rule of law. Here's why we object to it. I think that would be, that sort of education I think is really important. You're sort of calling forth those underlying values. People do feel they have a right to choose their government. They do feel that everybody should be equal under the law, but you have to keep reminding them, this has happened, it's threatening that principle. Here's why you have to reject and resist it.
We usually end with a period of quiet. I am going to try one more question. I'd ask you to try and answer in a minute, and then we'll just how can we, and this is a difficult question, how can we persuade the political parties to work together to introduce proportional representation? Because clearly it's not in their best interest to do so.
Well, it's only not in the interest of the two main parties, right? So most of the political parties do support PR. There was a huge campaign to get Labour to support it. 82% of Labour members support PR. The leadership and the unions effectively defeated that motion to conference last year. So, I mean, I despair of the Labour Party. What can I say? They would have been in government most of the time since the war if we'd had a proportional system, but they'd rather have absolute power for a shorter amount of time than share power for most of the time. I mean, members of the Labour Party who are here, that's over to you. I can't, I've tried everything I can think of. That's their choice. But that is a very important task, I agree. But a lot of people already on that task. They've succeeded with Labour members. They've not succeeded with the leadership.
Molly, this evening has been fascinating. Thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
sharing your time and your expertise with us. Friends, this is time to bring this session to a close with a brief silence in a moment. Do remember Saturday morning, you're more than welcome to attend. I can't remember the time, it's either 10 or 10:30, I can't remember, but the link will tell you what time to join us. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you, friends. Good night and farewell. Thank you, friends. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Molly.